Hi everyone, my name is Lisa Artigla and I'm the Consulting Director of Community Engagement here at Tamarack. And I am here today with our resident evaluation practitioner, Liz Weaver, to discuss some of our favorite tools for evaluating the impact of community engagement. So Liz Weaver is the co-CEO of Tamarack and lead of the Tamarack Learning Center. So the Tamarack Learning Center has a focus on advancing community change efforts and does this by focusing on 5 strategic areas, including collective impact, collaborative leadership, community engagement, community innovation, and evaluating community impact. Liz is well known for her thought leadership on collective impact and is the author of several popular academic papers on the topic. She is a co-catalyst partner with the Collective Impact Forum and leads a collective impact capacity building strategy with the Ontario Trillium Foundation. Liz describes herself as not a professional evaluator, but as an evaluation practitioner. So she's a doer of evaluation rather than a theorist, which I believe will be incredibly helpful to us all here today on this webinar as we look for practical tools for evaluating community engagement. So thank you so much for being here, Liz.
You're welcome, Lisa. Happy to join you.
So I'll be your host today, and our plan for this webinar is firstly to frame evaluating community engagement and explain the various types of evaluation, and really for the majority of the time that we'll be sharing with you, we'll be sharing examples and tools for different types of evaluation, and then we'll have time for questions and responses. So Liz, over to you. Give us an overview of evaluating community engagement.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Lisa. It's really a pleasure to join all of you today. We've seen to have lots of interest in this topic from the wide network of Tamarack members. It's interesting to think about evaluation in the context of community engagement. And so we like to always start presenting about this from the lens of what does evaluation really mean. And we know that evaluation is about assessing the why, the what, and the how of what you're doing. And it's really about understanding what's being accomplished, what hasn't been accomplished, and most importantly, it should be about what you're learning, how you're going to apply the learning that you have and adapt your strategies going forward, and particularly your community engagement strategies. It's really critical in this work to say, okay, so we tried this, it worked, and we got lots of people to respond, or we tried this and it didn't work, and hardly anybody responded, so how do we adapt our strategies to leverage what we're doing really well and learn from that, and to also understand what we're not doing very well. Evaluation isn't about coming up with measures that is about proving. This is really about learning and improving. That's the approach that we take at Tamarack. Lisa, if we could go to the next slide. So community engagement planning, it's really important to start your community engagement with figuring out what your plan for engagement is and then framing questions going forward. Right? So evaluation is really based on the plan that you have set out for yourselves and how you're going to evaluate that engagement plan, that engagement set of strategies that you're moving forward. And so this slide really helps you kind of understand that. So the purpose, why is this approach to engagement needed? Why is this initiative needed? What should guide our engagement intentions and actions? That's really about the values. Are we really approaching this from, you know, an inclusion perspective, an inclusion and equity perspective, or are we going to, you know, subset our audience in terms of the engagement strategy? So what are some of those driving values that we're going to be using? Who's our audience? Who do we want to engage? Who are our engagement partners? So this set of questions kind of helps you frame your plan and then also helps you kind of understand how you're going to frame your evaluation. Next slide. A really great example that I've come across of a community engagement plan that uses an evaluation component is the CAMH Community Evaluation Framework. And I've put the URL on this slide so that those of you that are interested, you can go after the webinar and take a look at it. What they've done in this plan is they've talked about the values and principles of their community engagement approach. They've talked about what it might look like and what different levels of engagement might look like. And then they have determined how they're going to evaluate their engagement strategies and as they move forward in engagement. So it's a very complete kind of approach, and it's a really good plan to use to look at as a template. Next slide. So we know that there are different types of evaluation, and as we go through the different tools, what we're going to do is come back to the different types of evaluation and let you know if it's a summative, a formative, if it's a process evaluation tool, etc. So a summative evaluation tool usually happens when the work is over, and the key questions that it asks is, how did we do? So did we achieve what we said we were going to achieve? To what degree did we actually do the things that we said we were going to do? Formative evaluation is really as you're forming your work, as you're planning it, as you're in early implementation stage, as you're kind of in mid-implementation stage, you really want to ask yourself, how are we doing? Did we get the right people around the table to help us with the planning process? Those are some of the questions that you ask in a formative process. A process evaluation is how good are we at getting the things that we said done. So you really want to look at, as we go through our process, are we getting those things done? Goals and outcomes is, did we achieve our program goals and outcomes? Impact is really looking at from the perspective of the participant or those that you're engaging. Did this exercise have an impact on them, and how will we know that? And then developmental evaluation is really that orientation that we have at Tamarack, particularly from a community change perspective. What are we doing to learn, and how do we adjust as we evaluate the strategies, the program design, the implementation design, the engagement design as we go? So these different types of evaluation approaches come into play, and there are different tools that you can use to tease out, your evaluation results at these different stages or these different types of evaluation. Next slide.
So what I'm hearing, Liz, is there's especially two things to keep in mind. There's the making sure that the evaluation that you're designing fits your plan, and then figuring out what type of evaluation you're actually hoping to achieve. And so as we go through today, this is a list of the examples and tools that we're going to share with you, and we're going to tackle them one by one starting right now.
I think you're absolutely right, Lisa. These are the things that people need to consider as they're thinking, particularly from the lens of community engagement, because it's the frame that we're looking at. Do we do formative evaluation around our community engagement processes? Do we do summative? And so the tools are helpful in really kind of thinking those through. And I think you're going to take us through the first tool.
Yeah, so I just wanted to share an example of a self-evaluation. And so this example comes from the town of Innisfil. And what this page is that you can see on the screens is it's both a summative and a process self-evaluation. So the box at the top is all the summative information. So which is the work is over, how did we do? So it asks questions like, what engagement activities did we do? Who were the number of participants? That sort of thing. And then at the bottom, it gets at some process self-evaluation questions, which is, again, that asking of how good were we at getting that done? So some of the questions you can see here is, what activities worked well and why? What activities were most challenging? What could be done differently? And so consider self-evaluation as something to always do internally with your team, as a way of learning and developing. It doesn't get at some of the goal-based evaluation and things like that we'll be talking about shortly, but it is helpful to develop a good internal process around self-evaluating and learning internally.
So the next piece is, again, looking at summative evaluation. We're going to look at an example of a community engagement scorecard. And a scorecard is really what you might present at the end of your evaluation to the general public or to those that you engage that said, you know, we engaged this many people and these are the things that we heard, or this is the depth and the breadth of the engagement that happened. And we're going to share with you the work that happened in Alberta around the Alberta Social Policy Framework. So in Alberta, they were developing a social policy framework for the province, and one of the key components of the framework was to broadly engage the citizens of Alberta, not just those folks that were working in organizations that might have a direct interest in this, but they really wanted to engage citizen voice in the development of this social policy framework, because the theory behind this was that if they did engage citizen voice, they would have a more robust, a framework that more people could buy into, and it then would really shape the kind of direction that the citizens of Alberta were interested in. And so you can see the high-level theme is speak, share, thrive. That was the purpose of their engagement strategy. They had a call to action, so their website was very much a call to action, and they had different methods that they used in terms of advancing their social policy framework, and they presented a timeline to their key partners. So it was a pretty comprehensive approach that they used. If we can turn to the next slide. So what you can see here in terms of their summative is the sheer number of people that they engaged. And so really what they were looking at is, you know, a significant amount of in-person engagement, online engagement, and different ways that folks could be engaged. And this breaks down both the volume of participation activity, the number of people reached, and then the total number of community discussions that happened across the province. So they measured engagement in 3 different ways. They want also online to look at their online engagement. So even though they had a fairly robust network of people that engaged in face-to-face meetings, they also had quite a strong network of people that followed up and engaged in online in a number of different ways. And then the third way that they reported on it was they looked at the geographic scope. So they really looked at who across the province of Alberta and what numbers of people across the province of Alberta actually engaged with their work. And so this gave them a good perspective as they started to do some analysis on the social policy framework. They could say to the folks that they had engaged in real concrete ways, look, we had a good breadth of engagement, we had a good depth of engagement, and we virtually covered the whole province in terms of the engagement. So it's a nice way of reflecting back to the people who were involved in the engagement process, you know, that involvement. What we have as a tool here for you is a community engagement scorecard, and this is really a simple framework for you to think about if you're wanting to put together a scorecard in terms of your engagement, really looking at, you know, what engagement level did you choose, what are some of the methods that you're going to use, what are some key outcomes of your engagement, what measures are important for you to track. So this scorecard helps you kind of, you can work your way through the boxes and you can kind of say, okay, so if we want to report out, you know, to our members or to the people that we engaged or to the general public, here's some prompting questions, some strategies that we can use to build our own scorecard. There's lots of examples of scorecards online. The colleagues at Tamarack were talking about the vital signs, the community vital signs that Community Foundations of Canada uses in many communities, and that's another kind of scorecard that we have in Canada that tells us how well our communities are doing according to a number of statistics. And there is an engagement strategy that parallels the Vital Signs initiative as well. So that's scorecards, Lisa. I think I'm going to turn it back to you for the next piece.
To kind of recap, when we're talking about summative evaluation, the design of that summative evaluation will really be dependent on what you actually did. So, if you engaged online, if you engaged in person, you'll want to make sure that you're capturing the data around each of those engagement activities.
Yeah, you want to, absolutely, you want to make sure you're capturing the data, and you probably also, one thing we didn't show you was also some of the key themes that come out of that data, right? So the net numbers, of course, but also the themes that are arising that result from the engagement process as well.
Mm-hmm. So the next type of evaluation we're going to talk about is formative evaluation. And so formative evaluation is evaluation that's done while the engagement is still in process. And so it's saying we're still at it, but how are we doing? And so one way that I find really helpful to track formative evaluation, especially online, is looking at the difference between how many people are aware, informed, and engaged of the work you're doing. So the screenshot here comes from Bang the Table's Engagement HQ platform. And so where this really helps is often we look at the number of responses we have, for example, and say, oh, 30 people, filled out the survey. And it's hard to get a sense from that number, just that 30 people, is this everyone who's interested? Is this actually representative of everybody's feelings? Whereas if you expand out and also look at, okay, who's aware? So who actually has read the information page about a project? Or who's informed? Who watched the video or read the report? If, for example, you have 500 people who are aware and 200 people who are informed, and then only 30 responses, you can then say, okay, people are informed about this, but only the people who had questions or concerns may have responded through the survey. So it can be really helpful to get a sense at, are we getting at everybody we need to? Is this actually representative of the population? So you can define your own, what does aware look like, what does informed look like, and what does engaged look like. But it's a really helpful view of understanding an entire population and how they might feel about the work that you're doing. So the next tool, and I'll let Liz share this one. This is an example of both a formative and summative evaluation.
Yeah, and so this, so if you remember when I talked about evaluation at the very beginning, I talked about the use of evaluation to improve our strategies, our community engagement strategies, and ultimately our outcomes. And so a user profile is really, you're asking, us as users, if we want to use this engagement strategy to really improve the way our programs and services are delivered, what are the key questions that we want to have answered through this? And so the user profile worksheet, which we've attached onto this webinar, really helps us kind of work our way through that with a series of prompts and questions, right? So the questions are, what are your evaluation questions from the primary user's perspective? Use, when are you going to use the results of this evaluation process? What are your preferences? How do you want the evaluation report to look like? And when are the windows of opportunity in terms of the evaluation approach overall? And so it's a really, I think, helpful tool in terms of giving you some focus. It can be used in the formative, so you can really look at it as you're forming and you're thinking, we're going to be the primary audience of this, so let's start asking these questions early and help inform, our evaluation design. But it can also be used in a summative kind of way at the end of your evaluation. If, for example, part of your evaluation obligations is to report back to a funder, you might then go into a meeting with the funder and say, we really want to know how you're going to, what questions you want to ask, and then how you're going to use the information and what time are you going to use it. And so this second slide that we have here comes out of the tool, and it actually gives you some examples of different folks and how they might respond. Now, I understand, and I can see that this slide is really too small to read, but the tool is a very helpful tool because it actually gives you some examples that have been taken from real-time examples. The names have been changed, but from real-time examples. And it really, I think, for me, helps me kind of prompt, not everybody's going to use the information at the same time. Sometimes we can do the evaluation around community engagement in such a way, we can set up evaluation around our community engagement strategy in such a way that it actually can inform then how we're going to deliver our program and service. So an evaluation user profile is an excellent tool for both formative and summative evaluation.
And what I love about it is I hate collecting data just for the sake of it, right? I'm sure everybody would feel the same. And so when I think of the evaluation user profile, it's really saying who's going to be the audience for the evaluation. Let's see what they are looking to learn and then collect the data to respond to that, instead of collecting all the data and then saying, okay, now what are we going to do with it? And so it's that, designing evaluations that are used instead of evaluating for evaluating's sake.
Exactly, Lisa.
Yeah. So the next one we're going to talk about is a form of formative evaluation. So again, that's about how are we doing in the process. And it's called the engagement funnel. And so we have a tool sheet that we'll be sharing with you about how to use this tool. But really, it's about, when you think about ongoing work, an ongoing initiative that you have, imagine the entire community that you're hoping to reach, and imagine plotting them on a funnel where at the top of the funnel we have people who are aware of the work you're doing. In the middle is people who are exploring or involved in some way, or engaged, they've responded. And then at the bottom of the funnel is the people who are the advocates, or the people who are on working teams and actively involved. And so the way, I'll give you an example and this is looking at the Tamarack database. This is a tool that we use ourselves, but we plot our network of learners onto an engagement funnel. So at the top are the people who are exploring. We have subscribers, we have online learners, like everybody here attending this webinar, and then we have people who attend events. And so we track how many do we have of each of these groups, and we set goals around that. So we want to have 70% of people who are subscribers or deeper. And so how this tool can be, it's first used to track, but then it's used to come up with strategies to deepen engagement. So you could look at people who are aware of the work that you're doing, but then you say, okay, we really want to move these people to the next level in the funnel. We want to engage them more deeply. So let's invite them to an event, or let's invite them to participate in some way. Or people who attend the event, let's invite them to be part of this working group. And so it's a helpful way. We look at the numbers each quarter. So it's a helpful way to touch base with, okay, of all the people I'm looking to engage on this issue, where are they at in terms of engagement level? And then based on that, what ideas do we have to deepen their engagement?
Yeah, I think what's really helpful about this, the engagement funnel as a tool, it also gives you a baseline, right? So you have your first number, which you can say, okay, this is where we started from, and as you track over time, you can actually track it back to the baseline. So it actually gives you a sense of what's growing, what's declining, and then what can we learn from growth in certain areas, decline in certain areas. Did certain of our strategies bring us more explorers than we anticipated, or did certain of our strategies lead to more subscribers? And so it gives you that baseline, and it helps you adjust your strategies as your network of members, as your network of community partners changes over time.
And we've seen people in particular provide this data to funders who are looking to get a sense of what's the community like. And we've also, we encourage people to get really creative with the names of the rungs. So for example, there was a group that I was talking to that were working in agriculture, and so they named the top rung seeds, and then the next one the sprouts, and then the saplings, and then the trees, you know, and to really just get creative and adapt it to your the field that you're working in.
So another tool that we use, and this is both formative, but it actually can move you along from formative right through to goals, outcomes, and impacts, is this tool we developed at Tamarack as part of our Vibrant Communities initiative called the Outcomes Diary. And the Outcomes Diary is really a simple tool. It's like a diary where you track change over time. So let's say you have a set of goals, a set of community engagement goals. Really what you want to do then is begin to, as you're putting your community engagement strategies into place, you want to say, okay, so what is changing for the individuals that are coming out to our engagement sessions? Are we able to bring more partners to the table? So what's changing for the way that how the community is working together? And then did our community engagement, did it lead to some kind of policy or systems change? And so sometimes we think about policy change as, you know, federal government policy or municipal policy, but there's another type of policy that we also have to pay attention to, because sometimes policy change can happen at the level of our organizations or at the level of our collaborative. So did our engagement strategy lead to some kind of different way of working within our organization around engagement, or different ways of our collaborative thinking about community engagement? An outcomes diary really means that on a regular basis, weekly, monthly kind of basis, you're capturing data, and you're capturing kind of data about how things are changing in real time at these three different levels. It can be really helpful to uncover patterns and changes that are happening within your organization, within the community engagement strategies, and that, if you use it intentionally for looking at these patterns and learning from these patterns, you can speed up your results and impacts. Next slide.
Oops.
So Lisa, I think this is for you, this next slide.
Yeah, so we're moving to goals and outcome based evaluation. And so this is probably my favorite type, but I'm biased. But again, in terms of measuring based on what you're trying to achieve, this is where goals and outcome based evaluations come in. And so the way that I like to design evaluations for that is to turn to the community engagement continuum, and often we'll use the continuum in planning. So to begin, we start to say, okay, what's your goals of evaluation? Is it to inform? Is it to involve? Is it to collaborate? And then once you know what your goal is, then you ask different kinds of evaluations questions based on that. So for example, if your goal is to inform people about something that your organization or city is doing, you know, and your goal is to inform the entire population, the evaluation question that you'll ask based on that goal will be, what percentage of the population was engaged, was informed. If your goal is to involve certain demographics in the work and in sharing their experiences of a certain issue, then your questions you'll ask different questions. So you'll ask questions about how many people were involved from those groups, did they feel comfortable sharing, that sort of thing. So really it's about saying, what are our goals, and then what are the evaluation questions that we're going to ask based on those goals. So we have a worksheet that you can use as a template for this. And really it's 3 columns where on the left you list your engagement goals. So in this example, and it's an example for participatory budgeting. And so goal number 1 was to educate the broad community on the budget. Goal number 2 was to understand the community's priorities. And goal number 3 was to expand the level of civic engagement in general. And so when you take each of those goals, you can then break it down to saying, okay, what are the key metrics that will get at those goals? And then what are the data sources we can actually use to report back on those key metrics? So with goal number 1, where our goal was to educate the broad community on the budget, our key metric, because there was a video explaining the budget, was number of people who watched the video. And our data source is our YouTube views. Just for example, we would likely share the budget in a number of ways. And so we would have a key metric that gets at all of the ways that we were trying to inform the broad community on that budget. Goal number 2 was to understand the community's priorities. And so we want to see what percentage of the population prioritized the project. So what percentage of the population actually shared back with us their priorities. And so the data source that was participatory budget submissions compared to how many people live in the area. And then goal number 3, which was expand civic engagement. This is the hardest one. So you can see that goal number 1 and 2 are quite specific, whereas this one, it's about expanding civic engagement. So how can we actually assess that? What are the key metrics we can ask? And so an example here is we could look at the number of people engaged that hadn't been engaged in any sort of municipal or community activity in the past year. And the number of groups involved that are not normally involved in political processes. And the way that we could get at that was through looking at the database, how many people are volunteering this year that weren't volunteering the previous year. And you can also do things like ask people. You know, it's not necessarily hard and fast, but, you know, how many times did you get involved this year? How many times did you get involved last year? You know, and so it's using people's qualitative responses in order to get at assessing those goals. So as you're applying this sort of thing to your own work, it's about first determining what your goals are, which we recommend you do right up front in the planning process, and then be aware of, you know, what are the key metrics and what are the data sources that we'll need in order to measure those goals.
Great. So the final tool, yeah, over to me. The final tool that we're going to share with you, it's a tool we also really like at Tamarack, and it comes from the international development context. It really actually is a great tool for capturing the most significant change or impact on the folks that are part of your engagement process, but it could also be used on the ultimate recipients of the change that you're trying to drive forward. We put the link in here, and it's a story gathering tool. So you can see in the graphic that there's lots of stories that are being gathered from the folks that are involved in the engagement process, and then leading up to, through an assessment, to the most significant change. So if we could go to the next slide, Lisa. The technique is very participatory, but it's also a monitoring and evaluation tool. It can involve many project stakeholders. If you have a community engagement team, you actually can engage them in the design of the process, and also engage them in looking through the stories and identifying the key themes out of the stories. So it can be participatory both in the development and in the design of it, but it also can be in the analyzing of the data. It's a monitoring tool, so you can do it at the beginning, at a formative stage, but you can also do it, you know, at the end as a summative stage as well. And it contributes to evaluation by both providing data, so the number of stories that are collected, the number of stories that fall into key themes that you've identified, so that can be very numeric based data, but it also gives you that story data as well. You'll be able to generate quotes and sense-making processes that really, and you can hear from the folks that are directly impacted, you know, what their stories are. There are 10 steps to the most significant change process, and the 10 steps are identified here. First, you want to get commitment from the organization that this is a process that you want to use, and also key commitment from the key stakeholders that you're going to engage in the process. The second step, which is defining the domain of change, is a critical step, and this is to really ask a pretty important change question. That change question has to be asked, the same change question should be asked of all the participants, all the folks that you've engaged in terms of responding to that question. You want to make sure that your data collection tool is consistent. You want to determine what the reporting period is. So over the last 6 months, what was the most significant impact or the most significant change in your thinking about community engagement? Might be a framing question that you would say, we want to find out about that. Then you collect the stories. You want to look at the stories and really make sure that when stories are collected, that you figure out how they're going to be collected, how they might be fed back to interested stakeholders. You want to have a part of your process verify the stories. You want to be able to quantify the results. You could bring in someone else to help you with secondary analysis or monitoring, and then you revise your community engagement system based on the lessons learned. We use this most significant change approach with our Vibrant Community Partners at the end of 10 years of funding from the J.W. McConnell Family Foundation. And what we wanted to do was understand what the most significant impact on them was, or the most significant change on them was, as because they were part of a broader learning community. So over the course of a number of years, we had connected them together as conveners of this work, as people that were engaging others in the work, and so we really wanted to understand, did the fact that we brought them together, did the fact that we engaged them more purposefully as conveners, did that make a difference to their ability to do their work in community change around poverty reduction? And so they each were asked to write 3 stories based on, you know, the domain question that we had developed. They came together in a face-to-face gathering. They told their stories to each other. They themed the stories together, and in the end we found that there was significant impact as a result of them coming together. There was impact for the work that they could do on the ground in terms of reducing poverty, and that had a pretty significant impact. There was an impact on them as community change leaders and as a network of people that were engaged together in the learning. And then there was kind of the policy impact. So we saw impacts, or they, in their storytelling, talked about impacts that happened at 3 different levels. And I think that the couple of times that I've used this this tool, it actually has led to a deeper understanding of, you know, the change that is happening and the impact of that change on the folks that are engaged in the process. So it's a really great tool. The manual is pretty big, but it can be very helpful to you. Why is it useful? It helps you identify both the changes that you anticipated, but also some of those unexpected changes. It encourages analysis and data collection. It can help you.
It seems we've lost Liz for a second. We'll wait to see if she joins back in. But I'll just jump in and talk about kind of the value of storytelling.
Team building.
Liz.
Go ahead.
We lost you for a second there when you were at about point 3 in describing it.
Oh, okay, I apologize. So it encourages data collection and analysis, and I was saying, Lisa, that it is also a very great team building tool, because when you get to look at the data as a team, it actually enriches the conversations that you have across your team members.
Mm-hmm. And I was
And this oh, go ahead.
I was just commenting on the value of stories as a way to share. I think often when we think about evaluation, we automatically go to, the hard data, right? And it can often be incredibly beneficial, though, to look at things like stories, to get the experiences of people who experience a program or a service and get them to say, what did this mean to you? And so we found that to be incredibly beneficial, moving beyond that hard data when evaluating.
Yeah, and you can use this. I mean, this can apply in a community engagement process as well to look at, if you brought some of your stakeholders together who participated in certain types of engagement processes, what was the most significant change of that engagement process? So if it was a deep engagement process where you're empowering people, did they actually feel like they were empowered? Or if you were informing people, did they feel like they got the amount of information that they needed to have? So you can do a most significant change light to actually prove or disprove, the goal of the evaluation process. Or sorry, the engagement process. So before we move on to questions, one of the things that we wanted to invite all of you to do is to let us know if there are any evaluation tools or engagement tools that you have used, or approaches or resources that you would like to share with us and with all the listeners on the call. So if you could type these up in the chat box, that would be really great. If there's a case study, a tool, or a URL, put it in the chat box. We will pull them all out of the chat box and share them with all of the listeners on the call. So with that, Lisa, I think we're going to now turn it over to questions.
Yeah, so as a reminder, you can write your questions in the question box at the bottom of the GoToWebinar panel, or you can tweet questions using the hashtag #TamarakConnect. And so I believe we have, I can start us off with one question that came in. And I think this is getting at the impact, how do you evaluate impact? So the question is, have you developed any methods for measuring the ripple effect? By that I mean changes that may occur several circles out from the original intervention. For example, a parent attends a community cafe, develops increased self-efficacy, goes back to school, models the behavior to their children who become, the first to graduate, etc. Liz, any thoughts on kind of evaluating that ripple effect of the impact of the engagement work?
Yeah, there are a couple of tools out there that really particularly look at splash and ripple kind of effects. Mark Kabaj and I, who do a workshop on evaluating community impact, talk about these. And some tools that you might want to look at, or some approaches that you might want to look at, are around outcome harvesting. And there's another one that I can't remember off the top of my head, but outcome harvesting is a really good one because it allows you to look at how you can harvest the immediate outcomes of the engagement, and then what are the strategies that you would put into place to harvest some of those downstream outcomes that you might it's a little bit more difficult, but you've got to kind of figure out, okay, so how do we collect the data to categorize or to know about some of those downstream outcomes, and then to what degree did we contribute to those downstream outcomes? The other thing that I might suggest is that there is some work being done around contribution analysis as well. So there have been some papers written about that where you can actually begin to identify, if there was a ripple, to what degree did that engagement experience contribute to that ripple. So look up outcome harvesting and also look up contribution analysis. And we'll put in our post email to everybody some links to some resources that we have on the evaluation part of the Tamarack website to those two topic areas.
Great. Next question. What tools and or tips do you recommend for evaluation related more to the middle of the continuum, so involvement and collaborate initiatives? Are there any particular tools or tips that you found effective, Liz?
That's a good question. I think it goes back to what you were saying, Lisa, in terms of what are the goals, right? And so, what are the goals around the collaboration part of that community engagement spectrum? So, what are you looking for in terms of the goals, and then trying to identify what are some evaluation questions that you might have around that. There are some good collaboration assessment tools that are out there. So early on in this presentation, you talked about self-assessment tools. So a really good collaboration self-assessment tool is the Wilder Collaboration Factors Inventory. So you can do it as a self-assessment, you can do it as a group assessment, and it gives you some ways of saying, are we collaborating as effectively as we can, and some measures. And you can, around your collaboration table, you can ask people to self-assess and then summarize the results, and then use that to to build a plan or a strategy going forward.
Mm-hmm. And something that's really important at those deeper levels of engagement is the fact that you're involving the community in the work. And so similarly, I would recommend involving your stakeholders in the evaluation. So instead of trying to look at methods of evaluation that are separate from engaging the community, use it as a form of continued engagement. So ask people, again, their stories, or ask them for what impact it's had in their lives, rather than trying to kind of go around the people who are in the room to evaluate.
Mm-hmm. I agree.
A question asking, might you be able to speak to developmental evaluation as well? Can you give us a quick summary of what that is, Liz?
Oh my goodness. Our workshop is like 3 days on developmental evaluation. My understanding of developmental evaluation is that as you're developing your approach, you are thinking about, okay, so when do we bring in formative, when do we bring in process evaluation? So it's the evaluation develops as you develop your strategies for going forward, right? So it's a part of the ongoing planning. It's a part of the execution strategy, it's a part of the kind of learning strategy, and it's a part of the kind of summative results-based strategy. So it really is that. It really is a process of development all the way through. And really thinking about, what are the questions that we want to ask related to engagement, right? So some of those early questions that you might ask around engagement are things like, who do we want to engage? Why do we want to engage them? What's the purpose of this engagement? Is the engagement using the engagement, the community engagement spectrum? Is the purpose to inform or to empower? And along this continuum, are we moving people along the continuum, or are we staying stagnant in one part of the continuum? So developmental evaluation is really thinking about the whole process, and then thinking about, okay, so what evaluation tools, techniques are part of that, and then as we evaluate the different components, what are we learning, and then how do we improve our strategies and techniques to get even better outcomes. So that really is, and I think developmental evaluation for me is really being curious about everything that you're doing, and always asking the question, well, what are we doing? What could we do what are we learning, and what could we do to improve our outcomes?
Mm-hmm. So the next question, is around, we've talked a lot about collecting stories and then analyzing the stories to evaluate. And so the question is, how exactly do you analyze a story in order to evaluate?
Well, if you were to download the most significant change document, they would give you a chapter on how to analyze the stories, and it would really be based on the process that you use in terms of using that approach. What we did in the Vibrant Communities example that I shared with you, we had conversations around the table with the different people that wrote the stories and asked them to participate in the analysis and asked them to see if themes emerged for them. So we had probably, in our case, there were 15 different folks in the room. They each wrote 3 stories, and then they sat at tables. So we didn't do one big storytelling approach. We did tables of folks clustered together to share their stories with each other, tables of, I think, 5. So they each heard 15 stories, and they came up with the themes, right? So they were part of the analysis. And then also as part of that process, we had an external evaluator observe and feed into the process. Other times that I've used most significant change, I have really used it in a way that the group determines kind of the key themes emerging, and that can become very participatory as well. Once they hear the stories and listen to the stories, then they can be quite part of the process and think about it from the lens of both a contributor to the story but a themer of the stories. In the workbook around most significant change, because it's used in an international development context, often the stories are gathered, in a country that is quite far removed from the head office of, the organization. And so what's really critical in that case is that the stories are verified, and that there is a process put into place around trying to train the people who are going to be doing the theming to understand how to think about theming, and then to see if the stories cluster under certain themes. And the workbook gives you some really great tools and approaches and ways of learning how to do that in a very practical kind of way. So I would say use the workbook as a reference guide for sure.
Mm-hmm. So next question, what do you think about using a mix of various tools to create your own evaluation strategy and cycle? How many are too many?
Well, that's a good question. I think it's absolutely a good strategy to use a mix of tools, and we often do, right? In terms of, if we look at engagement, we might look at online engagement, we might look at the number of people in the room, we might look at, as they did in Alberta, right? They used a mix of looking at their scorecard. They didn't just look at, how many people came to our events, but they looked at then how much online participation, what were we wanting to learn from the online participants, did we get breadth and depth of the province covered. So I absolutely think about different tools, different ways of gathering data, and then trying to figure out why that's important. There's a myriad of tools out there. If you go to the website betterevaluation.org, there's lots of tools and methods on betterevaluation.org that can be helpful to you. They're not all related to community engagement, but you can see how some of them apply to the community engagement lens. But I would say, how many? It would be a question of, my answer would be, it depends. It would depend on the time, the resources, the access to the tools, the expertise that you might have around the table. The one thing that I would say is, if you're thinking about evaluating your community engagement work, and you know that there's somebody in your community who has skills in evaluation, or someone in your organization that has that skill set, or a couple of people, bring them to the table and ask them to help you puzzle this out, because they can be great resources to you. When I was working at the level of community change, I'm an evaluation practitioner, as Lisa said, but I brought some of those evaluation experts in and asked them if they would help me, and they were more than happy to help me out. And sometimes you might have to pay a little bit for that, or sometimes you can ask them some questions and help you think about the framing and think about what's appropriate, and they'll lend their expertise as in-kind contribution. So look at those kind of resources to not have to start from ground zero, but to actually, you know, build your evaluation plan moving forward. And I would also recommend, you know, looking at things like the CAMH community engagement approach, to say, you know, their community engagement framework, to say, well, what have they done, and how can what they've done inform the approach that we're wanting to take. There's lots of tools out there. BetterEvaluation.org has tools around planning. Tamarack has tools around planning, and there are lots of other resources. The Canadian Evaluation Association and the American Evaluation Association are also good resources.
So we kind of came full circle there, where we started by saying your evaluation should really depend on your plan. And so I think that's what I'd want to reiterate as we close here, that it's really about first saying, okay, what is it that we're trying to do? Decide on the type of evaluation you need, and then, you know, start with your goals and spend the time measuring, you know, what it is that you're trying to achieve instead of measuring everything. So I want to thank you so much, Liz, for sharing your wisdom and experience and all of these tools with us. All right, over to you, Megan.
Great, and I'll echo that. Thank you so much, Liz and Lisa, for hosting. This has been a really informative presentation and discussion. And thanks so much to everybody on the call. I've had so many comments and questions and great evaluation resources that we will share out after the call when we send the recording to you. So it's been a great 1 hour with everybody today. So as promised, we will email you with the links to the audio, the slides for this presentation, and other resources early next week, so keep an eye out for that. And to stay up to date with the latest in community change and explore other opportunities like this one, visit our website at www.tamarackcommunity.ca. Thanks so much, everybody, and have a great rest of your day.